Hello, everyone. Welcome to From High School Social Studies to the College Survey, a conversation with teachers and students. And this is part of the AHA Online Teaching Forum. I am Laura McEnaney, the Vice President of the Teaching Division and a Professor of History at Whittier College. I want to cover a few logistical things before we jump into the webinar. All participants are muted, and if you run into any technical issues, please use the chat box and the AHA staff will do their best to assist you. A quick summary of how things will work today. Our panelists will discuss a series of questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. To submit questions to any of the presenters, please use the Q&A function. And we hope to address all relevant questions, but we want to be mindful of timekeeping. The webinar will run about 75 minutes. The question and answer with the panelists will be about 30 to 40 minutes, and then you all can jump in. We have a number of people viewing the webinar through Facebook Live, so please use the comments section to submit questions. And again, the AHA staff will pass them along to the presenters. Finally, I want to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording after the live session. Before we all jump in and get started, I wanted to say a quick thanks to Chris Gannon from the Social Studies Department at Herndon High School in Fairfax County, Virginia. I had the first conversation about this webinar with him, and I want to thank him for helping me frame some of these issues. Can I ask the two students to introduce themselves? The bio information for the teaching staff is already on our website, and you've probably seen that. But let me ask the students if they can introduce themselves real quickly.
So my name is Shelbie Britt. I am a senior history major at Mississippi State University in Starkville.
Hey, my name is Hanzala. I am a biomedical engineering and pre-medical major at Georgia Highlands College, about an hour north of Atlanta. I want to go ahead and become a surgeon. A little bit more background about myself. I came to the country about 4 years ago. I'm originally from Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and I am a non-history major, but I have taken high school history in America and now college history.
Great. Thanks to both of you. So I want to start out with Elizabeth. Excuse me. Elizabeth, can you describe the type of instructional experience that a high school student would have had in the fall and spring before the shift to online learning? And then after the shift to online learning, how did social studies instruction change? Were students doing mostly synchronous or asynchronous? Did they do discussion boards, study sheets? Can you give us a little snapshot of pre and post?
Sure. So what it looked like in a classroom, you kind of have two formats. So either you have a history teacher who has taken on and developed and worked with this new study of history with historical thinking skills, the use of collaboration, deeper analysis, and then you do still have that old school kind of study guide, remember dates and people. So you kind of have a little bit of both. But speaking from my experience, teachers in my classroom itself, there was always a lot of collaboration taking place. I didn't use the textbook a whole lot in my survey classes. However, I did use it more in my AP classes. And then with that, when you're looking at, your regular survey college prep course, students are working a lot with primary and secondary sources. They're coming up with arguments. They're looking at what it is to make an argument, support it with evidence, things like that. So a lot of writing takes place in the history classroom as well. Leading up to spring and moving to in-home learning, there was a huge shift. So in my district, we had about 6 to 8 weeks left of school, give or take. Probably a little bit more than that now that I think about it. And so we had to cover still a lot of history. And, what I decided to do, because I was very concerned about their social and emotional well-being, as well as making sure that they knew that I was still there for them, I pulled back a lot of what it was that we did in class. So when you looked at my classroom, it was a lot of asynchronous. So I would kind of record, hey, this is what you're doing this week, this is what it will look like, and then they could go about getting that done on their own. And that seemed to work better for students than trying to keep them live. The other thing that worked really well is I minimized the workload a lot. And I think a lot of teachers did that because we knew that we weren't going to be able to get as much out of our students because of our circumstance and what everyone was dealing with at the time.
Thank you. I want to switch to Kate and talk a little bit about your research team from the Cal State system. You embarked on a big study, and you've learned a lot about the ideas and assumptions a first-year college student brings into their introductory history classroom. In your case, it was U.S. history, but this webinar is really thinking about all intro courses, all survey courses. So first, Kate, can you tell us a little bit about what motivated the research project? And then can you share what your team learned about the students who enter a college classroom? What were their understandings of or assumptions about history? And these are the students who are coming from Elizabeth's classroom into our classrooms in higher ed.
Yeah, thanks. So our research project at the CSU came out of, I guess, bad news. The history introductory courses were labeled as bottleneck courses, that is, classes that were impeding students' path to graduation. And as such, we were eligible to participate in a funded scheme to redesign our classes and have some time to work on that. And so a bunch of us, I think 40 to 50 history faculty from across the CSU got involved and started redesigning our classes. And we were really excited by this and some of the results that we were seeing. But a small group of us began to wonder what was working, or, were we really doing the right things? So we started doing an actual research project to investigate this. And our survey that we surveyed around 400 students, and this was back in 2017, to see sort of who they were entering our classes. And then we surveyed them again at the end of the course to see what they had learned, whether their attitudes towards history had shifted any in the class. And so really going back to what Elizabeth was saying, we found some really interesting stuff about what students thought about history. I think when we got into this research project, we were kind of swayed by the kinds of data we were getting from the administration, which was talking a lot about the demographics of our students and kind of like the economic backgrounds of our students. But what we found was that really what students thought about history and whether they even really knew what history was almost as important as many of those other characteristics. And so I think what really fits with what Elizabeth was saying was the results of our pre-survey when we talked to students as they entered the class. And so clearly there must still be a divide in the ways students are being taught, just like Elizabeth just described, in that about 2/3 of the students that we surveyed said that history was about remembering names and dates. That's how you were successful in a history course. For example, one student said, what you need to do to be successful is to remember facts from history naturally rather than remembering them from the top of your head. And we were thinking, well, hopefully not exactly. A significant number of students said that their history classes in the past had been boring. And these were students, we were asking the questions about all of their history classes, not just US history, even though that's what we teach. But at the same time, there's obviously an influence of kind of what Elizabeth and teachers like her are doing in the classroom, in that significant numbers of our students also said that their high school experience had been really relevant to themselves and their personal identity, had helped them learn about the world, had helped them engage in politics, political conversations. So there's still this kind of disconnect we found in our students, and just really knowing what it is that history is and what they should expect out of a history course. And what we found overall is that when we could shift students, when we could help them understand what history is, when we could help them be better historical thinkers, they actually did better in our classes. And that was a really exciting piece of research, a really exciting piece of data that we could kind of quantify.
So thanks, Kate. Let me jump back into Elizabeth's classroom, and then I want to get to the two students. But Elizabeth, can you take us back into your classroom and talk about the skills that are being worked on in a history social studies classroom? What kinds of literacies are being developed, either written, oral communication, reading literacies at a higher level, talk a little bit about the kind of skill building you're doing in your classroom. Higher ed teachers are often curious about that kind of learning when we meet the students who come from your classroom into our classrooms.
Sure. So the one other thing I wanted to kind of remind everyone of is the last survey course that a student takes at the high school level in California, at least, is junior year with U.S. history. So by senior year, their year is split, between government and econ. But when you're looking at my classroom, I mean, I give my kids the tough stuff. When we're talking about the French Revolution and world history, I'm giving them quotes from Napoleon, and I'm providing them with these difficult texts. And now a lot of times when students see these difficult texts, they're like, nope, can't do it. It's too hard. I don't know what this word means. But providing them with the skills to break down, to analyze, to say, okay, let's read it a few times. And each time we read it, we're going to read it differently. Right? And I tell the kids all the time, I say, look, I've taught this all day long and I'm still seeing something new. And, even we're looking at visual analysis, teaching kids how to look at political cartoons. How do you break that down? I often ask my kids, has anyone ever taught you how to analyze or close read in this way? And they're like, no, this isn't normal. This isn't a normal history class, and so it's really shifting their perspective, right? And, working, I always fall back on those historical thinking skills because I wholeheartedly believe that those skills those kids can use in their lives. It's not just in a history class or in an academic setting, so close reading, corroboration. So taking different sources, putting them together to come out with some sort of, conclusion. The kids always tell me, we talk a lot in here. It's like, yeah, I want you to talk. I want you to have these conversations. I don't like a quiet classroom, and getting them to understand. And we always talk about different perspectives. What does that look like? When you walk in this room, what you see is not what someone else sees. And so we can take that same angle when we're studying history and historical figures and things like that. With the historical thinking skills, primary, secondary source analysis. What does that look like? Not just reading a textbook and answering the questions at the end of the chapter, but really engaging in the material. We're writing just as much as an English class, and they have to write, and giving them the formula of how to write, providing claims, what's the evidence that they can use to support it. So just making them overall better students, I think also will then make them better people.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. So I want to bring Shelbie and Mohammed into the conversation. Can you share a few of the challenges you encountered when you first took a survey history course at your school? Now, this is pre-COVID, because presumably we will return to the classroom. But first, talk a bit about some of the challenges you encountered as students when you first took a history survey course, and then can you speak to what happened in the shift to online learning, maybe some of the learning challenges for you in a history class. So Shelbie, do you want to get us started, and then we'll go to Mohammed?
Yeah, so pre-COVID, when I started taking, just intro survey history classes, I was in a really privileged position because I was able to take AP classes in high school. And so I was already prepared for just kind of like the ways in which you're supposed to engage with text or engage with the material. But I saw a lot of my classmates who hadn't taken classes like that or who had tested out of those classes. They just didn't kind of have that skill set. And so we spent a good portion of that semester with the TAs just kind of continually hammering in how to write an ID, how to read a primary source, how to work on these skills. And a lot of them, obviously just dragged their feet because it wasn't the kind of content that they were used to from high school. And so that transition, I think they found to be really, really difficult. And then kind of my experience with classes during the shift after kind of COVID set in was a lot of my professors scaled back the material, classes weren't synchronous, and it became a lot more dependent on the textbooks and not so much dependent on lectures. For example, like we never had Zoom calls or anything like that. It was just strictly, you know, here's your assigned reading, here's the PowerPoint, you know, good luck. And so those were definitely significant challenges.
Thanks, Shelbie. Mohammed, can you speak to some of the challenges pre and post?
Yeah, pre-COVID, so I studied history back in my high school in Dubai, and then I came here. I took my senior year at a high school in America, and I took the US survey course. And both, funnily, back in Dubai and here, my history was very memory-based. You know, learn the name, learn the year, learn the location. And then taking that and going into a college, the first test, you know, where it's a lot more critical analysis, where you dig deeper. What is the context? Whatever sources we're getting, are they reliable or not? I didn't build that skill set from the history that I took in high school, going into college. And then, you know, as Katherine was saying, that happened to me. I took the first test, didn't go that good. And I was like, great, history bombed my GPA. I had that mindset being a non-history major going in. So yeah, definitely, that was the biggest challenge for me, not having that critical analysis, analyzing the primary source, digging into deeper details of the author, knowing if it's reliable, you know, that sort of things that you apply in a college course. I didn't have that. So that was the biggest challenge for me, transitioning from high school history to history in college. Luckily, my professor in college, he helped me build those skills. He made history a lot more engaging. The class in college, we had a lot more discussion. It was a lot more analyzing. So I went from a non-major saying, you know, why am I taking history? It's going to bomb my GPA, to taking 3 history courses that I didn't need. It was fun.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely that was a big shift going from high school to college. And then post-COVID, of course, the biggest challenge that I have is looking at a screen and talking to a screen. Going from, you know, being in a class, talking to the professor, having students around you, to just by yourself, looking at a screen and still be able to concentrate. That was the biggest challenge for me. I struggled with that in the beginning. So yeah, I mean, that's what I went through.
Thank you both. And I also love the perspective, Shelbie as a history major, Mohammed as a non-major. These are really valuable perspectives to have. I want to go back to Kate for a minute. Kate, we talked earlier about the student assumptions, because your study examined students' assumptions about what history is going in, and they thought it was memorization. In fact, it's interpretation. And so part of your work was trying to help them understand what the discipline is. But you also found some assumptions among faculty, and your article dispels some of the common assumptions we have as faculty about who our learners are. Can you speak a little bit to what you took away from your research for faculty ideas and preconceived notions?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things that changed for us was the realization that one of the things that hold back introductory learners is not necessarily a lack of preparation or external factors, things that are going on in their lives that mean they don't have time for history. But I think it's really what Mohammed just brilliantly described. It's just not really knowing what history is, not really knowing what's going to be expected of them in a history class, and then sometimes not having the resources that Mohammed did to help them along to learn those skills, right? And so we went into the study thinking that we wanted to collect data on a lot of those external factors, a lot of those demographic factors. But what we found was really freeing, that in fact, we could do a lot within our own classrooms. We could do a lot to help students figure out what history is. And we could do a lot to help them with the methods and tools that are already well established among historians. Probably that everybody in this webinar here today is very much familiar with. So it was really freeing. Instead of looking at things on, our university has a dashboard of data where you can see who's in your classes and whether they're doing well or not, whether they're not doing well. That instead of sort of obsessing over those numbers, we could think about what we could do. We could think about the things that are within our control to do. And that was, I think, a really freeing thing. So stealing from my colleague, Bridget Ford, who's on the team with me, she was really talking earlier in the month about, you know, what we have to do right now is just to really explain to students what history is and why we do it, as a way of communicating to them why they should want to learn it, why they might find those skills really useful, like Elizabeth was saying, that they will use those skills over and over in their lives once they understand, what they are. So I think that was really important. Those are the main sort of assumptions that we changed. And I don't think we did anything revolutionary in our classes in the way that we redesigned them. As I said, it was really just so many of us coming together to talk about what we did, and having the institutional support of the CSU in the redesign. And you can read in the article about some of the strategies that we employed, but they're really all just drawn from basic historical thinking skills, just like Elizabeth was talking about, and scaffolding the assignments so the students like Mohammed can have that moment where they realize what they're supposed to be doing and then learn to do it, that kind of thing. So I'm really helping the students to just kind of figure out why history might be important to them and to their lives. That seemed to be really important as well.
Great. Thank you, Kate. So I want to go back to Mohammed and Shelbie for a minute, and ask you, from your student perspective, what do you think an entering college student will need in an intro course this year, in a year of lots of I don't knows and lots of uncertainty? What do you think an entering college student would need in an intro history course or a survey course this year? And let's start with Mohammed this time, and then I'll go to you, Shelbie. Go ahead, Mohammed.
I think the most important thing you can do when taking an intro course now in this situation is set out a routine, set out a time for studying, set out a time where you're by yourself and you can concentrate and go over your material. I personally struggled with that, and when we shifted online, because you're going from going to a school where you have access to a library to being at home. So I do think one of the most important things any student going to take a survey course is set out a routine. And second, there is a lot of reading in history. There's a lot of analysis when you take college history. So just be a little prepared for that, especially if you're coming from more of a memorization background. So just be a little bit prepared so you don't take your history class and do the first test and go into a shock.
Great. Thanks, Mohammed. Shelbie, your thoughts on this?
I think one of the biggest things that a student entering a history class this semester is going to be, for me personally, flexibility. I think that, it's always incredible to have a routine, as Mohammed said, because that's kind of what makes you feel like you're in an academic setting. It's what makes you, quite frankly, just not go crazy with the change. But it's also, the ability to kind of like say, well, I'm going to have to scoot, some activities back because I have 50 pages of this to read tonight and a book report due tomorrow, and those things like that just kind of pile up. And so I think it's kind of giving yourself like the break on just not sticking to a schedule all the time, but also understanding like I can't let all this pile up. So just, I guess, time management skills.
Can I ask, before I go back to Elizabeth and Kate, can I ask you, Shelbie, and then Mohammed to weigh in a follow-up question? Was there something that a faculty member did in this shift to online that was particularly helpful to you? Is there an anecdote you can share from the shift? Something that a teacher, either an attitude, a stance, a strategy that they used that you remember is particularly helpful for you?
One of my professors for my history, science, and technology class, she was just very understanding. Personally, I work full-time when I'm not, on my university's campus. And so with COVID, I had to go back home, which meant I was back working full-time. And, while I'm thankful to have a job, it did make balancing a full workload and a full course load. It was just very, very difficult. And so this particular professor just was very understanding when something was 5 minutes or 10 minutes late, or, when I said, I'm just having trouble focusing today, and just kind of, she did a very good job at fielding some extra questions that I had. And so it was just the understanding of the circumstances that were surrounding the class and how that might lead to just a little more support needed.
Great. Thanks, Shelbie. Mohammed, was there anything you remember, a stance, a strategy, an attitude, an orientation that was particularly helpful for you?
Yeah, my biology professor and even my physics professor, they started leaving last 5 minutes of class just for a casual discussion. You can discuss about anything, class related, non-class related, any problem you're having at home. if you're not, familiarizing with the new technology, just any sort of open discussion. I feel like that was very, very helpful to me as a student.
Great, thank you. I want to go back to Elizabeth and Kate with a final question, and then we'll open it up for questions to our participants. So building on what Mohammed and Shelbie have been sharing with us, what are some of the teaching stances, strategies, or orientations that you think might be helpful for teachers entering a very uncertain period this fall? And I ask you, Elizabeth, as a high school teacher, and then Kate, I'll turn to you as both someone who was part of a Cal State team that studied this, but also as someone who has been teaching and experienced this pivot yourself as well. So Elizabeth, do you want to start us off, and then we'll finish with Kate?
Sure. I think that what has been offered from both of the students here is that, we have to remember a student is a human, right? And that so much of what students are learning in the classroom, they're balancing a lot. And I often tell my students, I say, look, this is the place to fail because, you have the support you need, right? And as teachers and educators, it isn't our job just to provide content and teach students academic skills, but also provide that human connection. And I think that's what, both Shelbie and Mohammed said, our professors were humans, and just having that normal conversation. I think that what's so important for us as teachers in the high school setting and ways that we can prepare students is to just provide them with support, and that, specifically when it comes to history, provide them with, really turning our classrooms into skills-based learning, providing them with opportunities to exemplify their work in ways that work for them, providing them with different opportunities or different ways of learning, because when they get out to college, when they get out into this real world, so to speak, they need to have that experience. And, I often think about, what's going to happen to my students when they get to college, and what is that going to look like? I also think about, are they going to take history classes online, or are they going to take history classes in a big lecture hall? And that we will be online in the fall, but eventually we won't be anymore. And so how can we support those students? Because when you're in a big lecture hall, I think you feel really alone, even though you're with a lot of people. And I think sometimes it can be very intimidating to speak to your professors. So what can I do in my classroom? I can make sure my students know how to speak to adults. How do you approach an adult and have that conversation? How do you write a proper email? So more of those soft skills, that can help them, in the big term, because so often those survey classes are huge, like 300 people, and so you can just very easily get lost. I go back to those historical thinking skills, the analysis, those abilities for them. But what I think students at my level don't make the connection of is they treat each class independently of each other. And I think we really have to change the narrative to say, no, what you're doing in here, you can use in English and you can use in math and science, and getting them to understand that really history, and I might be biased to this, is the most important because it does help you in every other area of your life. So
yes, I love that you said that. Right, the skills they're learning in your course are portable to other settings. I also, as you were speaking, I could see Shelbie and Mohammed nodding their heads. So Kate, do you want to weigh in on that question as well?
Yeah, I mean, first, I think I just want to back up what Elizabeth was saying, or support what she was saying about really making the high school classroom a place where students learn those skills, because our data really shows how important that is. We kind of have two numbers that we throw around. One is that students who shifted their historical thinking skills and were able to improve them over the course of the semester, so people like Mohammed, they scored on average 4 percentage points higher in our classes if they were just able to, do that shift that Mohammed explained so well. Like, I thought history was all about names and dates, but by the end, I'd actually become somewhat of a history enthusiast. But we also found the students like Shelbie, who came into the course already with pretty strong historical thinking skills, Students who had strong historical thinking skills at the end of the course, whether from a shift or just existing skills, they did on average 5 percentage points better. So like how students transition into our classrooms is really, really important. So everything that the high school teachers can do to prepare the students for this class, especially for students who are now going to have to take it in this kind of somewhat challenging online environment. And I think that's really, really important for sort of both sets of students. But I also wanted to talk about kind of the current situation that we find ourselves in as something of an opportunity, and kind of offer the experience of our research team. As I said at the beginning, we didn't necessarily go into this redesign willingly. We were kind of prodded into it because our courses was, people were saying our courses were a problem. And it was really good for us. It was really good for us to take a long, hard look at what we were doing, to take a long, hard look at some of the equity gaps that we have in our classes, to take a look at, who we're serving and who we're failing, and really think about that as we redesigned our courses. And so this is kind of a moment to think about what it is you're doing, and as you prepare to go online, to think about how you might do that differently, and in some ways how you have to do that differently. I've been teaching online for a while, and right now I'm training faculty at SGSU. We're training almost 1,000 faculty signed up this summer to learn how to teach online. So there's definitely a perception among all of us in college that this is something new and we don't necessarily know how to do it, which is really cool to kind of say, like, I know a lot of things about what I know, but I don't necessarily know about this particular modality. So that's, it can be an opportunity to try out a lot of these things that we're talking about. Online lends itself very well to, throwing out the textbook, abandoning the idea of covering everything, because, Mohammed definitely backed up my feeling earlier that my PowerPoint Zoom lectures were about the most boring thing that he could have experienced. So, I need to throw those out and think about what else I can do, and, bring in a lot more scaffolding, bring in a lot of formative assessments so you can check on those new learners and make sure they're learning what they're supposed to be learning. So there's a lot of that going on.
I want to transition now. I want to thank the panelists. These are the questions I had for the panelists, but I know we have a lot of people out there who have already started submitting their questions. So in the spirit of continued conversation, I'm going to read aloud some of the questions that are coming over the transom. And I'm going to direct some of the questions to our panelists, but I also want panelists for you to jump in, talk with each other, and continue the dialogue in a way that you think would be most helpful to our listeners or our viewers. So I want to start with the first question. This comes from someone who asks, I am teaching a history survey class of 110 students that will be all online. Would you suggest having the class meet synchronously each week, or do everything asynchronously? Shelbie, did you want to weigh in?
Yes, I have a lot of feelings about synchronous classes. I think ultimately it's just going to lead to students kind of joining the call and then turning off their camera and turning off their audio and then going back to sleep. I think that the best way for students to engage with the material is going to be on their own terms. And if that's at 2 o'clock in the morning in this kind of new circumstance, and that's just how it is. But I think that's just the best way for you to get engagement.
Thanks, Shelbie. Mohammed, did you want to weigh in on that? And then Elizabeth or Kate, if you had thoughts on that, and then I'll move to the next question.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, ever since we shifted online, I've had both asynchronous and synchronous classes. And personally, I like it a lot better when I'm able to engage with the content on my own. And then, we have a meeting where we can go over it, have a discussion-based class or something similar. If it's just going to class and just going over a PowerPoint, I can guarantee you sometimes I'm muting my video, my volume, shutting my video off, and just doing something else.
Mm-hmm. But it's interesting what I'm hearing you say there too, both of you, is that there's sort of content delivery that you want on your own terms. But I heard you, Mohammed, say that you still want some discussion. You want some sort of human interaction to process. Did I hear you right?
Yeah, I think my physics professor this summer did it perfectly. All the material, he made lectures and he gave us to go over it on our own terms. And then the class period he used to go over questions, concepts, not necessarily a PowerPoint or lecture. It was a lot more discussion based. And I personally like that a lot. Because, you know, lecture I can go over my own terms. I can whenever I have time. This was a lot better because you don't have that personal experience in a classroom where you can, you know, raise your hand and ask any question or stay after class for 5 minutes and go over anything that's bothering you. So I personally like that a lot better.
Great. Thanks for that clarification. There are strong opinions on synchronous and asynchronous, depending on who you talk to or what your institution wants from you as an instructor. Kate, any quick thought about that? And Elizabeth, and then I'll jump to another question.
Yeah, I'm just responding to something that I saw in the chat, and I was also thinking as Mohammed was talking that what Mohammed was really just describing there was a sort of a classic flipped classroom that, you know, the sciences and math have been using for many years to, I think, quite great effect, but we are not so into typically in history. But the idea of delivering the content to the students to let them move through at their own pace, and then using our class session for active learning, for going back over things, for helping students with the skills that they need, that works equally well in a history classroom. You know, it can be hard. It's definitely harder in a 100-person lecture hall in the hall, and it's, you know, has its own challenges in a 100-person classroom on Zoom or whatever you're doing. But I think whether students prefer synchronous or asynchronous tends to be more about what the synchronous session is used for rather than the format itself. You can create community and collaboration in a totally asynchronous class, but you could also use synchronous sessions to help students get to know one another and feel a little bit connected and understand the material. But I tend to agree, my own experience lecturing in the spring, I tend to agree with Mohammed and Shelbie that students are turning off the microphone, turning off and going away. And I know this because when I would put them in breakout rooms, several students would just be sort of still sitting there in the main classroom because, well, they're not really there. So I think it really depends on your personal preference, what kind of class you're trying to run, and, you know, what you want to use the synchronous sessions for, as to whether or not you do that. We were really put under, you know, we had to decide this very early on because our campus decided we were going online way back in sort of April, and so we had to choose back then. So I already set my classes, and I'm going to do a mixture. So I think it can work either way.
Elizabeth, any thoughts about this from your perspective, especially as we're thinking about continuity or discontinuity in learning experiences from high school to college? What are your thoughts on synchronous, asynchronous?
I think that you kind of have to do a little bit of both, but as everyone else was saying, you know, it has to be purposeful. That synchronous has to have a purpose. So, and providing students with that expectation, you know, okay, we're going to be, you know, on Thursday, we're going to be discussing XYZ, you know, whatever the case might be, but they have to come with something. So setting that expectation. And I also think when you're, and I don't know how feasible this is, but in 100 to, you know, a huge lecture, why not the opportunity of, say, 50 kids meet on Tuesday and 50 kids meet on Thursday, or, you know, providing multiple synchronous opportunities for students in a more intimate setting, to provide them with that, okay, I'm not just a box on a screen, you know, and giving them that opportunity to know that you're heard and you're seen. And I think, you know, tying it back to history, we study the people who are heard and seen, and we all have that voice, you know, so kind of just setting that example. That flipped classroom, I think, works. You know, you provide all of the content and information up front and available to students, and then you ask them to come with something, you know, in that circumstance, and, you know, set it as an expectation. I think, you know, in a high school, I assign, you know, okay, you have to speak this many times, or you have to respond to, you know, I always think of like the online college where it's like post a discussion and respond to 2 people, you know, how can we elevate that in a way that is, you know, that we can use face to face versus just a discussion board or something like that. So.
Great, thank you. so much. Shelbie, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just, while Elizabeth was speaking, I was reminded of something one of my professors did that I think would be a really good suggestion, actually. So we had to submit questions to a discussion board about the reading, and it had to be like, so many characters, so the professor was sure that we were, really getting at it. And then in discussion the next day, we would only, sometimes things would get brought in, but we would kind of primarily focus on the questions that our classmates and like we had asked. And so that way, I think we all felt more, kind of like we had more skin in the game as far as, discussion, because we felt like we were helping our classmates, they were helping us, and we were all kind of working through our issues together with the material.
Really interesting. Thank you, Shelbie. And that leads me to another question on synchronous, asynchronous. And this one I'll direct at Kate. The question reads, I am toying with having synchronous discussion based on a schedule that is friendliest to at least most of the students in the class. We can record it, but I always do worry that students who cannot make the meeting and must rely on the recording are at a disadvantage, and they're essentially having a different experience. How can I make this fair, or am I overthinking this? Kate, can you speak to this from your experience training faculty and also teaching so much online?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I said before, we had to pick. So I know for my synchronous classes, they have a scheduled class time. So I think for what Elizabeth was saying, breaking your classes up is an awesome idea, but we can't do that because our students have already picked their schedules. But if you do have the flexibility to allow students to kind of choose a time, particularly kind of like a bigger office hour or something like that, that could be really effective. I think yes, that is probably a good instinct, that students who can't come at all will have a different experience if they're not participating in a live discussion. But recording it still does allow them to see what happened and to see if their understanding of the class was, of the content was the same as other people's in the class. Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because is that reason enough to not hold a synchronous session because you fear that some students might not be able to be there? I think that's really true. But now we know we're going online for at least this whole, from my campus, at least this whole semester. You could hope that students were going to be able to participate in the class time at least as much as possible. But yeah, if your campus has not block scheduled students into synchronous sessions, that could be a difficult thing to pull off. I agree.
Yeah. I think a lot of us faculty, we're just looking at trade-offs, what we have to trade off in the learning experience. I want to jump to another question, and this one I want to direct at Elizabeth. We have a question on the C3 framework, so if you can talk a little bit about what that is. But the question reads, in order to understand the preparation and expectations of my first year university students, I've often referred to the C3 framework from the National Council for the Social Studies. Do you find the college career and civic life, which is the C3 framework, a useful reference point for post-secondary instructors? So Elizabeth, can you speak to that?
I don't have a lot of training in C3, but I just pulled it up. So that's what's nice about this, right? I think that using this framework, I think just from what I can see here, I think it's a really good place to start. I think it pulls in that the wholesomeness of this, and this experience for students, just in regards to not being just an academic course, but what are we doing to get the students to understand history on a larger scale? I think that, just looking at these things, these are all necessary things for students to understand, right? Like, what is our civic duty? And they get that experience in high school, but only for a semester, in their government class. And so, trying to get our students to understand, our district does a really good job of requiring students to participate in the community as a term assignment. And I think that students in general don't understand sometimes what that means. You know, what does it mean to be an active participant in your community? And history allows that opportunity, right? And I think this framework, I mean, I am very curious. I'd like to look more into it because it seems to align with my pedagogy and how I think. But I think it's a really good place to start. And the more that we can make history meaningful for our students, you know, providing the multiple perspectives, providing, you know, their history in the classroom, obviously is a huge buy-in. You know, moving away from this very Eurocentric history and moving more into a representative history of everyone is really going to shift. And I think, you know, along with our pandemic, but what else is going on in our country right now, it's a necessary shift, you know, and I think that this framework allows that shift to really effectively take place very easily. So I hope that answered the question.
Great. The next question I want to ask is really for everybody. What are some good suggestions for building community among students in an online environment? And this is certainly something that Shelbie and Mohammed have experienced and something the two teachers on this panel have tried to create. So does anyone want to start that discussion about ideas to create community even though we're disconnected? How do we connect?
Can I start if you guys don't mind? So for me in a history classroom, especially going into the fall, this is a conversation I'm having with a lot of teachers right now is how do we create community with students from a screen, right? And I kind of always think about like, what's it gonna be like when I actually meet them? You know, like how is that gonna feel? And I think that, you know, we really have to base our teaching, and I think this goes across the board in college as well, is creating that community very early on. I was reading somewhere that it's necessary for at least a week or two right in the beginning to not do content, but just to do community building. And then if you want to add the tech side of it on there, a friend of mine were discussing how, you know, she had this great idea. She said, well, I'm going to have them do the community work, but also do it in the practice of how do you take a picture of something you wrote and post it, and how do you we use like Flipgrid and, you know, different online tools, Padlet, things like that, and have them practice those things. Because with any technology, and we're seeing it with the professors and teachers right now, is we need the practice. When it comes to technology, you have to have the practice of playing around with it, seeing how it works, what makes sense to you. You can't just watch one YouTube video and then think that you know it, right? And also like setting the standard of, hey, we're all gonna fail in this, and that's okay, right? And sometimes our internet's gonna go out, and that's okay too. So just a very forgiving culture, I think, is also really necessary right now, because so many of us are in these, I mean, all of us are, it's an uncharted territory, you know, so I think being open and honest with our students allows them to feel more comfortable in being the same with us and reciprocating that.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Any others on the panel who want to speak to this notion of creating community when we're on screens or we're asynchronous? Any thoughts from other folks on the panel?
So I can talk a little bit about what our team found and my own experiences. You know, one of the things that we worked on in our course redesign, even, you know, 5-6 years ago, was the idea of building community in our classrooms, because, you know, for the majority of our students at the CSU, even before there was a pandemic, even before there was, you know, unrest in the country, we were trying to build community among them, because we have a, you know, majority commuter campuses. And so we found that, you know, walking in, just as Elizabeth, I think, described earlier, walking into a large lecture hall, it's a really intimidating thing to do. And, you know, you need to be able to just know some people in your class to help you along the way. And so we've been experimenting with some tools that we think move very well online to help. A lot of it is collaborative learning, scaffolded collaborative projects using Google Docs, because our students don't always have the opportunity to get together on campus. So we've always set a lot of this work up online so that the collaboration happens. And that can be whatever tools that you have on your campus. We use a lot of Google Docs, we use a lot of campus groups, just really simple stuff to let students work together and try and practice those skills together so that they can see somebody else struggling with historical thinking and sort of figure out how to do it. That was really one of the ways that we started doing this. And then also we've been working a lot with peer mentors, which has been really important to help create community. One of the things that we found, and I might ask the students about, is just that you have to push students to feel that history is something that they'll struggle with, that they're struggling with. Most of the time they feel they must just not be remembering it well enough or something like that, like if they haven't had the experience with historical thinking. And my experience has been that, when I have access to a peer mentor, and I love my peer mentors, is that you often also have to push the students to go see them. And then when they do, they have a really great experience, and it helps them figure out kind of what history is. But we really have been encouraged by the idea of bringing peers into the classroom, whether that is history majors, history master's students, trained mentors from the peer mentoring department at our university. So different, we've all done different things, but I really appreciate that. I think it's easier for students to find community with somebody on their level than necessarily to feel like they can come to you and ask you those questions, or even to know that there's a problem, I think. So yes, definitely community with peers is really important.
Yeah, one of the things you cite in your study is how much collaborative learning you're having students do, how much lateral learning they're doing. And it struck me that you're building in the icebreakers at the beginning, but you're doing continuous icebreakers for the students when you set them up to learn collaboratively. And quick thoughts about building community from Shelbie or Mohammed, either one. Otherwise, I'll move down to the next question.
Collaborative learning obviously is a great idea. I think that the best way to kind of build community is to struggle together, because if you don't know what you're talking about and they don't know what they're talking about and you both figure it out, then hey, you have a buddy. And then you kind of feel like, oh, well, I have to go to class this day, or I have to participate, because you feel like you're doing it kind of for the other person. And so I think that kind of pack bonding mentality is one of the best tools.
Yeah, I agree with what everybody else had to say. When you start a class, a quick note of introduction to everybody else, or a small project that you do as a group, I feel like personally that helps me build a sort of community with my other students. And sometimes, as peer mentors, they really help. And as she was saying, I think it was Katherine, that you have to push students. For me and like students like me, incentives work really good. So a couple bonus points or something along those lines might not be a lot, but you'd be surprised how much that can push a student to just go and, have that first icebreaker, approach a peer mentor, approach your other students. And once you start doing it, then you realize it's not that bad. And it just builds upon that first moment to push the student to do it the first time. That's really important, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. I want to build to the next question from this about inclusion. This question asks, in both the high school and college classroom, how do we create a space for students who don't see history as for them due to the erasure of their identities in a traditional historical narrative? How can a survey course be inclusive for students of color, low-income students, international students, and first-generation students? So I'll open that up to anyone who wants to start that conversation.
Well, in some ways, I think inclusion can go hand in hand with the idea of creating what history is. And so part of understanding what history is understanding that history is a story that's been told and retold. And so very much not just including those topics in your teaching and what you're presenting to your students, but also making sure the students understand that history in the past has not always been inclusive, and to understand that maybe narratives they've learned in the past have been missing perspectives, because those two things I think go hand in hand in terms of understanding how to model inclusive content, but also model what history is, and that it is inquiry, and that it is discovery, and that it changes. And to really that can be a really eye-opening idea. Our students just talked a lot about the idea of perspective. They really wanted to be able to understand different perspectives on history. And that's when history started to come alive as a discipline for them. It was something that included stories that they felt related to them, but also how they understood how these perspectives had perhaps been missing in the past. I think it was both of those things can help to build more inclusion.
Yeah, one of the things that is so important in your study is that you're inviting students in by introducing what the discipline is, and building on something Elizabeth said is you're not asking them to receive it or memorize it, as Shelbie and Mohammed have said doesn't work for them, but you're asking them to do it, not just receive it and memorize it. Elizabeth, you teach in a district that has all of these students. Do you have any thoughts about an inclusive classroom, some of the strategies or stances you're using to build that, to prepare them for an inclusive college classroom?
Yeah, I actually teach, I teach at a Title I school, and I also teach the inclusion classes. So I have students with IEPs in my class. And so, I know that as an educator, I can always do a better job of, providing that inclusive environment in the stories. I think that, for a long time, it's been, that Eurocentric, and, the adoption changes are happening, right? And so how can we help, boost those and make them better? And I think that there's a lot of online resources now that provide that opportunity of that other perspective, or that, just a different perspective. I always think about when I cover the Industrial Revolution with my world history kids, they love it because we talk about the perspective from a child, and it makes such a shift for them. You're not talking about these great leaders, but instead you're talking about kids just like them, and so you can just see the light, just really click. And then when we talk about the Vietnam War, that's a really touchy subject in my area. And so it's, how do you properly address those topics to make sure that all voices are heard? And I don't have an answer to that, and I think that's just a continuous conversation. I think that there's more and more things coming out now. Like I'm aware that there's a social justice set of standards now that have come out in the last few years that I think are worth looking at and trying to incorporate in some way. I think in history, we are we're where it starts, in changing this perspective and pulling away. I always think about when I introduce my students to geography, I show them one map and then I show them a different map, and we talk about how big Africa actually is in comparison to what most maps carry it as. And so we talk about, well, why would it be that way? Why does it look that way? And you just start to see it click a little bit more. But I don't have an answer, but I know that I'm doing as much as I can to incorporate their history into the history class, and it makes a world of difference, and it really allows ownership, for them too. So,
any quick thoughts from either Shelbie or Mohammed?
Yeah, I think perspectives are very important because, tackling that Eurocentric problem of history and bringing in foreign perspectives help a lot, even in a course like US history, for example. I have only been in the country for 4 years. I wasn't able to connect to US history as much as a world survey. But even in US history, when they're talking about perspective of immigrants or perspective of Asians coming to US, I'm from the Middle East, or I'm an immigrant, I've only been here 4 years. So I can look at that part of US history and relate to that. That's my perspective. And so even with that history of a country that I've only been in for 4 years was a lot more relatable than I thought it would be.
Interesting. Thank you, Mohammed. I want to shift to another question, and we have been talking together for an hour, so we have about another 15 minutes for questions. This question is about what I'll call current events. For this fall in particular, do our students feel it would be appropriate in a history course, US history course in particular, but maybe all courses, to allow and pre-plan for a kind of decompression session after the US election? I'm not saying it has to be a current events, though a historically informed current events session could always be possible in a course. So any thoughts about that? Because we have a really important fall coming up for all kinds of reasons. Any thoughts about decompression after the election, having students really engage that?
I as a student, would kind of fear, if I put my mind kind of in the shoes of my professors or teachers that I've had, that some students may not feel as safe to share their experiences, even if, the educator goes above and beyond to make, it clear that this is a safe place to talk about your views and your stances, and, we're all going to be respectful. Like, you just can't guarantee that some things aren't going to get taken out of the classroom. And so some people just may not talk about it, or some people may not feel like they're educated enough to talk about things. Or, some people just may not be as involved in that. And so I just kind of, I would feel a little, a little uncomfy kind of going to class, even if it was a classroom that I was, I had 7 people who I've taken other classes with. I would still kind of feel weird. And that just might be, the kind of Southern manners kind of thing. You don't talk about religion, politics, or money, but, that's my concern.
Thank you. That's really, you're channeling some of what goes through my head when I entertain that. Mohammed, and then Kate, I want to turn to you because I know your study talks about engaging current moments. But Mohammed, any thoughts on that to build on what Shelbie said?
Personally speaking, I would love some sort of decompressing session after the election. It's so polarizing right now, and decisions are being made that affect me as an individual and other students as individuals. So it would be really, really helpful if we have some sort of, as long as you can keep it away from political debates and away from sort of a heated session, more of a decompressing session. I personally, if my professor did that, he would be my favorite.
Thank you both for those two distinct perspectives. Kate, I want you to weigh in here because your study talks about engaging purposefully current moments, but through a historical lens, which this questioner referred to.
Yeah, and I think Shelbie and Mohammed kind of show us how difficult this is to do well, and really what we've been struggling with for the last couple of years, as we realized that when we looked at the survey of students coming from high school and realized that they were coming with this really strong background of feeling like history related to their lives, feeling like history helped them feel more engaged, and realizing that our courses didn't, that they wanted that out of our courses, but we weren't necessarily trained to deliver it. In fact, we were kind of often trained quite the opposite, right? Which is to focus on the history. So I don't think we really have the answers. We've been sort of playing around with some different things. And what we've kind of come to is very much the same thing that we're saying in all of our research, is that setting it up is really important. And I think Shelbie is right to be concerned that if you kind of just walk into the classroom and say like, hey, let's talk about the election today, you might get a lot of blank faces and students just not really feeling like they feel comfortable. But if you have set it up, if the election has maybe been a thread in your class, and if you're relating it to the subject, if you can relate it to what you're doing in the classroom, it's a much more comfortable conversation for students. And I'm not going to put Shelbie on the spot to say if she'd feel more comfortable in this way, but how does this election compare to elections of the past, right? Asking students to make a comparison and to make their points based on evidence rather than necessarily their personal opinion is a much more comfortable and safe way to have that conversation, and allow students to kind of share their opinions about what's going on in the present day, but asking them to maintain their historical thinking skills while they're doing it, to kind of set things up. I don't know. I tried this 4 years ago and it was a real bust. So I'm going to be really curious to see if doing it this fall, that there will be more engagement and more interest in students in understanding what past elections and what past historical moments can help us understand about today, and if students are more interested in engaging in this present moment.
Kind of with the circumstances that you just, or not circumstances, but with the framework of kind of making it like a central thread in your classroom, I can see how, and honestly, kind of thinking about it, mulling it over while you were talking, I would be excited about that discussion under those parameters, because it would make me feel like, if this was something I didn't already feel, it would make me feel like history belonged to me. History was for me. Like I was able to kind of like shape the history that would be told, or shape the events of today. What I'm trying to say is that it would make me more aware that we are living through historical events, especially in a time of, global pandemic and also unrest in the country. And I think that would help me, if I was a student that wasn't previously engaged with the course, to engage with it, because I would be able to put myself in the shoes of other people.
Great, thank you. I want to shift to another question here, but I see these as all related in a lot of ways. This question comes from a community college professor. I teach at a community college, and I do so along the historical thinking lines that Elizabeth spoke of. But the school where I work has a lot of teachers, professors, who basically just lecture and expect students to memorize for exams and then assign papers, but don't teach students how to write or how to do research. How do I address what history is to my students when they've taken another intro course at the same institution from someone who does not teach the way I do, without making a value judgment against those lecture-prone professors? Elizabeth, this might apply to you in comparison with other history teachers. And Kate, I can come back to you as well. Any thoughts, Elizabeth, about this? Because you've talked in previous conversations we've had about the fact that there are generations of high school history teachers, and some really are teaching memorization, and others are really doing inquiry-based learning as you're doing. So any thoughts on this for this participant?
I think that, that continues to be a topic for us, is how do we, at so many school sites we see, it's the older generation, this is what I've done, I stick to my guns, this is how I teach, and so I think that what I've done in my classroom, because a lot of students come into my class, I've taught primarily world history the last 4 years. So the last time they saw history was in 8th grade. So when they get to my class, I always have a survey at the end of the year and ask them what they liked and didn't like, to get feedback from them. And they always tell me, oh, well, I actually kind of like history now. Like, it's different than what I thought it was. And getting that feedback from them, it tells me, okay, I'm doing what I'm supposed to, right? I think at the beginning of the year, at least in my class, and I think you have an opportunity here as well at the college level, when you have students who are coming from that memorization background, is to, explain history in their terms. When we talk about, and I don't know if anyone's familiar with SHAG, but they do a really good job of introductory historical thinking skills, and, talking about it's a lunchroom fight, and they talk about how the different perspectives, well, who's telling the truth? Or, we do a big murder mystery investigation in my class, and that, and I think even at a college level, it's okay, and it's okay because you're getting them to understand what history means. And it's not, this is what I always tell my kids. I said, it's not always about the old dead white guys. We don't care about them all the time. And, and really getting to the deeper meaning of things. And, so I do quite a few things to really get to know the students too, have them write their own history. What is your history? What are the events in your past that make you who you are? And that, a lot of that comes from the SHAG website. And it really helps the kids get it, because then I can always go back to it and I can always say, hey, remember that murder mystery and how you collected all of that evidence? Well, you've done the same thing when we study whatever it is that we're studying, the American Revolution or whatever it is, right? And so they are able to connect better. And I think that that's a really easy way. And even if it's kids who've had that skill, it doesn't hurt, for them to do it again and have that reminder. So.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Kate, any thoughts about those differential experiences a student
Mm-hmm.
can have either in high school or in college, depending on the teacher they get and depending on the generation of that teacher and that teacher's particular training?
Yeah, it's all faculty diplomacy, right? So, I mean, I think one of the things I do is just talk about it as a difference in teaching style, and not necessarily, regardless of whether you may have a personal idea about which one is better for students. But many of my colleagues who lecture, they're really good at it. And when students come to my classes from those classes, they'll talk about how like entertaining, or how they learned so much, or many students do enjoy to a certain extent that experience as well. So I tend to talk more about how the fact that those are not my skills. I'm not a sort of a comedy performer who's really good at delivering long lectures. And so I talk about the way I teach leans into my strengths, which is as a facilitator and as somebody who's trying to drive inquiry and trying to, help students figure things out for themselves. If I could deliver a really entertaining 45-minute lecture, I probably would, but, I leave that to my colleagues who are good at it. And so kind of talk about it that way, that we're approaching history in different ways. And I think you're going to enjoy this class. And if in the past you haven't enjoyed that kind of memorization approach, then give this one a try. Maybe you'll like it. I mean, I do every semester have a couple of students who are just like, I just wanted to sit in the back and listen, and Professor Chilton wouldn't let me do that. So, not everybody likes that approach. So just to kind of be honest about what you're going to do in the class. But I agree, that's a fine needle. But, one of the things I found over the last 5 years of like doing this research project and having my colleagues learn about it is we've all been moving. We're all moving further and further away from just that lecture multiple choice. And even my colleagues who teach 120, the what we call like the mega sections, they are doing their best. They are doing their best to bring in as many engaging activities as they can. And so I think we're all on a path moving away from that style to, to the best of our abilities in terms of our teaching style and the structural and sort of infrastructure impediments we might have to changing too.
Great, thank you. I want to move to the last question and then we'll do some quick wrap-ups. And this question is especially for Mohammed and Shelbie. This questioner is a high school teacher. I am a high school teacher who helps run a small humanities project-based curriculum and will also be mostly online this fall. One of the things we do to ensure students engage with the material is to present reading and literature elements as part of what we do. But one thing I found is that students don't always value history content, that is nonfiction narratives, as this person puts it, as much as they read and enjoy the more English-based fiction content. What do you think can bridge that gap between the nonfiction narrative and the fictional narrative? And this questioner, again, a high school teacher who is especially curious what Mohammed and Shelbie have to say about this. Go ahead, either one of you can jump in.
I think if you make the history part more, I don't know how to word it correctly, if it's more relatable, like you can apply it to current events more, I as a student would engage with it more than nonfiction. But I guess that question is a little bit hard to answer because it comes to the preference of the student. But definitely for me and my perspective, if the history portion that I have to read or engage with is relatable, like a quick example that I can think off the top of my head is, the 1920s pandemic. You can relate history on that to what is happening right now, and it's very similar in a lot of aspects. To me, that would be a lot more engaging. I would like to read that over literature. But if it's just some fact, that I really don't care much about, or it's just a fact to me, I wouldn't be that much invested in it. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Mohammed. Yeah, Shelbie, did you want to add to that, build on that?
I mean, honestly, I completely agree with what Muhammad said. It is going to just come down to interest, and if students feel like it's relatable or not. I know a lot of my teachers, when they were kind of introducing something that was going to be kind of a more meaty historical text, we would watch like the crash course video about, that general topic. So we felt like we had kind of the scene set in the space already defined that this text was going to be operating in. And that kind of helped us be able to relate it more, because they do have a really comical delivery that's very engaging and interesting. And so I think that setting the precedent for engagement would help it carry on throughout, the reading of that text or that activity.
Thanks, Shelbie. And I'll ask Elizabeth to, since this question was from a high school teacher, I'll ask Elizabeth to weigh in, and then we'll wrap up. Any thoughts on this, Elizabeth, about how you navigate that difference between fiction and nonfiction, and how you get students excited about stories in general, perhaps?
I tell anyone who listens, I'm an actor in my classroom. And so I really try and make it as relatable to the students as I can, right? So like I come up with different ways of explaining it before they read it. I explain it in a very teenage way. So for instance, like when we're talking about the Declaration of Independence, we play some Taylor Swift and we talk about it as a breakup letter, and they get it. And so getting to their level, if you can start at their level and explain it at their level, then you can elevate them higher. I use a lot of visuals in my class and a lot of, videos, short videos, but I always tell myself, and I tell the kids, I was like, if I got bored watching it, well, I'm not going to show it to you, but YouTube is such a gateway to get material to students, especially our visual learners, into engaging in the text, more deliberately, I guess. So it's a lot of acting. It's a lot of storytelling. I'm not a good lecturer. The kids tell me otherwise, but I hate lecturing. It's just not my thing. And I always go too long. So, just short, quick stories, help it make relatable. Here's the summary of what you're going to do today. Here it is. And so when they're reading it, it's okay. Like she did say this, like, okay, I can see that, and that seems to really help them make it not as overwhelming, especially when you're dealing with, these historical texts, but also say like, look, well, they were young too, or whatever the case might be.
Thank you so much. So we have to close, and I want to really sincerely thank the panelists, especially our two student panelists who were willing to respond to the call. And one of the things I want to say is the research is out there. If, as Shelbie says, we're all struggling together, and I love the way you put that, Shelbie, we are all struggling together. The research that the Cal State team has done is out there, and I think we've linked to it in the chat, or at least on the AHA page. And that article is full of insights and wisdom for anybody trying to improve their practice. I also want to talk about why I wanted to do this, especially because I think we need to build that connective tissue between high school teachers and college teachers. These are conversations that I know we want to have more of with the AHA. So as the Vice President of the Teaching Division, if any of you in the audience, participants, have ideas about how we can continue this conversation, I would love to hear from you. But we are trying to figure out how to be human and how to build connective tissue in this very strange moment of online teaching. So thanks to everyone. And I hope you found this conversation beneficial. Good luck.